We have with us on the phone Dove of Oneness from the National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, otherwise known as NESARA. Welcome to Contact Talk Radio, Dove.
Hi.
How are you?
I have to stop right now and just mention that the real name of NESARA is not on the Internet. You cannot find it.
Oh.
Except in my information, and that is because the U.S. Supreme Court justices who had the NESARA law drafted put a gag order on the real name and on all of the true law information, so you cannot find it anywhere. There is a prototype NESARA bill on the Internet that is meant to give people a taste of NESARA, a hint of what the real one is like, because they were hoping, the justices and their allies were hoping to get some feedback. It has turned out to be used as a disinformation tool by some of the websites on the Internet, not by ours, 4Winds10 or NESARAnow.com, but by the NESARA.org people who are actually the Bush regime attempting to keep the NESARA law from being announced. So the correct name of NESARA, which I was given permission to tell this last fall, is the National Economic Security and Reformation Act. And those two words make this an entirely different legal entity, and they are not to be confused. The one on the Internet was put there initially in a good way to be utilized as feedback, but it's been terribly distorted by the NESARA.org people who are the Bush regime, and it simply you just have to cut both of those totally apart because they don't relate at all.
Well, it's a good thing we brought this up then.
Absolutely, because some people will go out, hear NESARA, and type it in and think that this is the authentic one.
Right.
Yes, so it's perfect that this has come out.
So let's start, Dove, with your involvement. How did you get involved in NESARA? And give us some background for our listeners about NESARA and how it came about.
Okay. I was researching some other things a few years ago, alternative health therapies and technologies and energy technologies and so on. And in researching these things and some humanitarian improvement projects that are coming down the road, I ran across this information. And the instant I ran across it, I knew this is it. This is what we have been waiting for thousands of years on this planet, to change everything and lift everything up. This is it. This is the pivotal public event to the shift, the great shift of the ages, from the age of darkness, which we have been in, into the age of light and humanitarianism and upliftment. And this is the public, physical, nuts and bolts way we're getting there. And that's why I'm here, that's why I'm on the planet, is to make sure this gets done. And a lot of other people are here for the same reason. It's time for this massive change to occur for the better of all people on the planet. And when I discovered NESARA, it was actually being leaked by naval intelligence people. Naval intelligence officers and agents were talking about this secret law that had been passed in March 2000, and I heard about it in June 2000. And this law was supposed to have been implemented in the year 2000 before the elections. It was signed by Clinton on October 10, 2000, and I had that verified by an NSA agent, and we had this ready to go, but it has been blocked by what I call the dark agenda forces, the dark agenda groups on the planet who continue to manipulate and control our governments, our banking, and a lot of other things. So I'm going to talk about what NESARA does, and people will quickly see some of the major shifts this creates. It abolishes the IRS entirely. Instantly, the minute NESARA is announced, the IRS stops collecting taxes, is allowed only to do refunds for income taxes, and some of their personnel will be put into a new division because the revenue for the government will come from a new national sales tax on new non-essential items only. So it gets rid of the IRS, and it creates a new kind of revenue for the government, which is a sales tax that does not hurt people because it's not on used items and it's not on essential items. It is on new items, and even there is a certificate that people will receive where a certain amount of new items every year will be exempted from this. So it immediately gets rid of one of the biggest bullies on the planet, the IRS, and takes that bully boy out of the federal government's hands and totally abolishes it. Some other things it does is it forgives credit card debt, mortgage debt, car loans, personal loans, refinancing loans, home equity loans, anything that you have that is bank-related debt. And one of the things it does is it pays the banks $8,500 per credit card account to zero out those balances on the credit card. So the banks are being paid to zero out these different kinds of loans and credit card debts. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, tremendous bank fraud has been done to the people of the U.S. and frankly around the world in most other countries where this same kind of fiat money system exists, like the Federal Reserve. And two, because of the fraud, and the U.S. Supreme Court found there was fraud, and I'll explain where that comes from, they ruled there had to be remedies, financial remedies. And so that is what the credit card debt, the mortgage debt forgiveness, and so on is all about, is financial remedies for humongous fraud. In addition, the bank records of the old banking system must be zeroed out. So this is also an accounting process to zero out all of these debts, which cannot be converted to anything righteous. They are so messed up, they cannot be converted. They must be zeroed out. And we will have a new banking system, a new U.S. Treasury Bank System, and new U.S. Treasury currency backed by precious metals. That will be instant. The minute NESARA is announced, the Federal Reserve will be essentially abolished and absorbed as far as facilities and personnel into the U.S. Treasury Bank System, and we will have new currency coming out. We will be exchanging the worthless Federal Reserve money we have now for new U.S. Treasury money that's backed by precious metals. In addition, NESARA requires the immediate resignations of Bush and Cheney and all of the current regime and the Congress. And this is because there has been a history of fraud and of manipulation and of taking away our constitutional rights for many decades, not just the last few years, but many decades. And in order to clear the whole mess out and start fresh, we are going to have mass resignations and new elections within 120 days of NESARA's announcement. NESARA requires that a president-designate and vice president-designate be sworn in immediately in the first 15 minutes of the NESARA announcement process. And the NESARA president-designate will declare peace. And one of the reasons he will do that is because peace is what is necessary for the international banking changes that will follow NESARA to occur. We will have this happening in our country. Other countries are also poised to announce their own new banking and currency systems based on precious metals. We are essentially going back to what people call a gold standard, and that is for higher economic security and to get us out of this mess that the governments have gotten us into, which basically our birth certificates, our properties are backing the government. And the banking system. That should not be the case. And the Federal Reserve banking system is very fraudulent. So right away what we see is, and that as soon as the designates are sworn in, they're going to go over this, the president-designate will go over these major points I've just discussed. And they will declare peace, and they will call the U.S. troops back to the country.
Now, let me ask you something, Dov. This obviously sounds like a win situation for the people, but, you know, there's got to be a balance. So who loses on something like this?
All the people who've been controlling your life. Okay. Your government officials, many of them are just totally corrupt. The banking system is very corrupt, and it's the few who have been controlling the masses for decades, and this hasn't been an accident.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in doing my research on why NESARA changes things and rolls back to 1933, for example, we find that Roosevelt made us the enemy of the country, made us the enemy of the government. And all he did was change a few words in the Trading with the Enemy Act. And we were suddenly the enemy of the country. Did you know you didn't have to get a driver's license before 1933?
I had heard that, yes. Yes,
and
I've
the
heard
reason is that the legal meaning of license is to permit someone to do something that otherwise would be illegal. So all the business licenses, all of the driving licenses, all of the Social Security, get your Social Security number requirements, those were all after 1933 when we became the enemy of the government, of the federal government, by what Roosevelt did. And from then on, we were no longer in constitutional law. We have not been in constitutional law since March of 1933. And within a few days of being sworn in, Roosevelt had a couple of laws passed in Congress. The Congress didn't even read those laws. That's the same thing they did with the Patriot Act. It wasn't read. Nobody had a printed copy of it. And it's this kind of manipulation of our people in times of stress, and often the stress is manipulated. Now I'm going to explain where NESARA came from. It came from a 1993 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was the accumulation of 30 years of lawsuits by the Farmers Union up and down state courts, finally getting to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they proved that the U.S. government and the banking system were in collusion to defraud the people and had created tremendous fraud against the people, had foreclosed on farm properties, and then they also found along the way, because these farmers who were taking these cases up and down the courts were being harassed by the IRS, they went and investigated that and took into that U.S. Supreme Court the fact that the IRS had never been ratified, that was a complete illusion. There was manipulated information, there was falsified information showing the states had ratified the amendment, but it never had been ratified, and it was a complete lie, and always has been. So they proved that in court. They proved the fraud of the banking system in foreclosing on their farms when the bankers had big farming corporations in the wings waiting to buy these individual farms up. And they proved the collusion of federal government officials who were actually looking the other way, being paid by the banks to look the other way to help in this robbing of our farms. So we had a great deal of things that came to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1993, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the farmers were correct, and then they had to come up with how to fix the problems. So they built coalitions of economists, monetary system experts, constitutional law experts, all kinds of experts in these various fields, and they came up with a series of changes that had to be implemented in the federal government. And they worked initially, there was a group of justices of the U.S. Supreme Court who were assigned to this project. And that's how rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court get done, is that the justices, when the ruling is made, then certain justices are appointed to work the project and get the rulings implemented. So initially they worked with the Clinton administration to get these things implemented in a series of contracts called accords. And the Clinton administration didn't want to resign. So what they did was they took the U.S. Supreme Court to the World Court, and they attempted to get the World Court to overthrow what the U.S. Supreme Court had decided. However, the World Court in 1998 did uphold the major points of the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings and found that these changes were valid and necessary. And in 1999, the true NESARA law, the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, was put into Congress. It was introduced into Congress. Now, you can imagine the Congress people have to resign, so they dragged their feet on it. They did not want to pass it. And in March 2000, there was a required meeting of members of Congress, and they passed it at that point.